We usually operate under this comfortable assumption that math is universal.
Right.
2 plus 2 equals 4, whether you're in New York, Jakarta, or Delhi. And by extension, we assume accounting software is just, well, a fancy calculator.
A very fancy calculator.
Exactly. You feed it numbers, it crunches them, and it spits out a balance sheet.
It's a comforting thought, but it's unfortunately completely untrue. When you actually peel back the layers of global finance, you realize that math is absolutely subject to geography, law, and even culture.
And that is exactly what we are digging into today. We have a stack of technical documents here, specifically a massive changelog and localization guide called Indonesian Development Localization.
It's quite the read.
It is. It's for a software suite, osFinancials, and TurboCASH. And honestly, reading through this, it felt less like a tech update and more like a lesson in international diplomacy.
It's a really dense document, but it tells a fascinating story. We aren't just talking about translating English words into Indonesian. We are looking at how you take a single piece of software and force it to obey two completely different legal systems.
Just by changing how the code interprets the local language?
Exactly.
So the mission for this deep dive is to see how that sausage is made. We're going to look at how one language file has to serve two countries that are financially almost polar opposites.
And we'll get into a very strange linguistic battle.
The battle between batch and journal.
Yeah.
Yes. Why that distinction matters enough to, rewrite the source code. And we'll look at technical bugs that reveal just how fragile these systems can be.
It covers everything from the nuances of Islamic finance to the nightmare of character limits in database fields.
So let's start with the map. We're focusing on the Indonesian language, Bahasa Indonesia.
Right.
The software obviously needs to work for companies in Indonesia, but here's the twist in the source material. This same language file has to support Timor-Leste.
And this is where that whole assumption that translation equals localization just completely falls apart.
Oh, so?
Linguistically, you can use the same file. I mean, Timor-Leste uses Indonesian as a working language for business because many people were educated during the pre-1999 Indonesian system, but financially.
They're on different planets.
Different planets, absolutely.
I was looking at the notes on this, and the disconnect is it's jarring. Indonesia is a massive, highly regulated economy using the rupiah. Timor-Leste is a small, young nation using the U.S. dollar.
Yes, the U.S. dollar. So right away, your software has to handle currency symbols and formatting differently while displaying the exact same language. But the bigger issue is the legal framework.
Okay.
Indonesia has the IAI, the Institute of Indonesia Chartered Accountants. They have a very mature set of standards called S.
Right. The document mentions S a lot. It lists things like SECITAP, SECIMKM, and SEC Siraya. Now, I know S Siraya refers to Islamic finance.
It does.
Does the software actually have to function differently for that, or is it just a labeling thing?
Oh, it's definitely not just labeling. It changes the fundamental logic of the ledger.
Okay, how?
In conventional accounting, you have interest income, but in Sharia-compliant accounting, usury or riba is prohibited. So the software can't just calculate interest. It has to be configured to handle profit-sharing ratios, or nisba.
So if the software is hard-coded to think in terms of interest,
it's useless to a Sharia-compliant firm. It's non-compliant. The code has to be flexible enough to swap out the entire mathematical engine based on the user's religious compliance needs.
Wow. And that's just inside Indonesia.
Exactly. Now take that software across the border to Timor. They don't use SEC, they use IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards. But here's the kicker. Their official legal language is Portuguese.
So wait a minute. I'm a user in Delhi. I'm looking at the screen in Indonesian because that's what I speak with my suppliers.
Right.
My bank account is in U.S. dollars. But when I print a report for the government, it needs to satisfy Portuguese legal requirements.
That is the reality. And the tax system is where it gets really, really dangerous for the developers.
Okay.
Indonesia uses a standard value-added tax, or PPN. You have input VAT, output VAT, and you pay the government the difference.
Which is pretty standard globally, yeah.
It is. But Timor-Leste doesn't have a VAT system. They have a sales tax.
Is there a functional difference in the software? I mean, tax is tax, right?
A huge one. A massive difference. VAT is a credit system. You claim back what you paid on materials. Sales tax is usually a one-off charge at the point of entry or sale.
What?
So if you give a user in Timor-Leste the Indonesian VAT siajak, they might try to claim tax credits that don't exist legally.
Oh, wow.
They could be committing tax fraud without even knowing it just because the software led them down that path.
So the localization team had to build a switch that says, if the user is in Timor-Leste, turn off the VAT engine and turn on the sales tax engine, even though the language on screen is still Indonesian.
Correct. And to make it even more complex, the Indonesian tax rate itself is a moving target. The guide highlights the change from 11% to 12% as of January 1st, 2025.
I saw that, but there was a note about effective rates that confused me. It sounded like the government was saying the tax is 12%, but also it's not.
That is essentially what's happening. To protect purchasing power, the government might say the statutory rate is 12%, but for certain goods, the tax base is only a percentage of the price. So the effective rate the consumer pays works out to 11% or even less.
So the software has to store the 12% rate for compliance reporting?
But perform the math to result in an 11% charge on the invoice.
That sounds like a nightmare to maintain. You're just coding exceptions upon exceptions.
That's the job. If you miss that nuance, your client overcharges their customers or underpays the government. Both are very bad for business.
Let's zoom out a bit. We've talked about Indonesia and Timor-Leste. What about the neighbors? The guide mentions Malaysia briefly. Indonesian and Malay are very similar languages. Can't they just share the file?
You would think so, right? They are mutually intelligible in a casual conversation.
Yeah.
But in a legal or professional context, they're very distinct.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Take the word for accounting itself. In Indonesia, it's akuntansi, which comes from a Dutch or English influence. In Malaysia, it's perekonan.
So if you try to sell accounting software in Kuala Lumpur and the main menu says accountancy,
It looks unprofessional, it looks foreign, it basically signals to the user this wasn't made for you.
right?
Even basic terms differ. An account in Indonesia is akun. In Malaysia, they often use akun. It's a tiny vowel shift. But in a database, that's a completely different string of text. So close enough just doesn't count.
This brings us neatly to the second pillar of this deep dive, the battle of terminology. The source document spends a lot of time on this conflict between two English words, batch and journal.
This is a classic case of English ambiguity causing chaos downstream for translator.
Okay, so what was the problem?
The software has a function where you group financial transactions together before you post them to the ledger. In English, developers historically called this a batch.
Which makes sense, a batch of invoices, a batch of receipts.
Sure, but batch is also a critical term in inventory management, a batch of milk, a batch of pharmaceuticals. These things have expiry dates and lot numbers.
I see where this is going. The translators didn't know which batch was which.
Precisely. They were translating the financial batch using the words for warehouse inventory batch.
Oh no.
So you had German accountants looking at a screen for financial posting, and the button labeled batch type was translated as staplart, which implies a physical stack of goods instead of journal tip.
So the user's sitting there thinking, why is the system asking me about warehouse stacks when I'm just trying to pay a bill?
It creates total cognitive dissonance. The fix was pretty drastic. The developers realized they couldn't just keep correcting the translators, they had to change the source.
The English source code.
Yes. They created a new file, englishjournal.dfm. They went through the code and scrubbed the word batch from all the financial modules, replacing it with journal.
So batch entry became journal entry.
Right. By forcing the word journal into the source, they forced translators in German, French, Indonesian, everywhere to use the correct financial terminology. It was like a linguistic guardrail built right into the code.
It's fascinating that the English source had to be fixed to save the translations. But looking at the Indonesian translation specifically, the overhaul was massive. The document says over 4,000 translation IDs were reviewed.
It was a huge cleanup operation. They were replacing generic sort of street-level Indonesian with professional financial terminology.
One that stood out to me was the change from tagihan to factor. Tagihan means bill, right? Why is that wrong?
Tagihan is just too informal. You get a tagihan from your mechanic or your friend, but factor refers specifically to the tax invoice, the factor pajak.
Oh, I see.
In the Indonesian tax system, the factor is a legal document. If your software generates a tagihan, it feels amateur. If it generates a factor, it feels compliant.
And what about this NIB versus NPWP issue? I saw that in the changelog.
That's a crucial addition. For a long time, businesses just needed an NPWP, the tax ID. But recently, Indonesia introduced the NIB, the Business Identification Number. It's part of their new one single submission system to streamline business licensing.
So if the software only have a field for the tax ID, the NPWP, and nowhere to put the business ID, the NIB,
then the business can't print their official documents correctly. The software becomes obsolete because the legislation moved on without it. Adding the NIB field isn't a nice-to-have, it's a requirement for modern compliance.
It really highlights that software isn't static. It has to evolve as fast as the government bureaucracy does.
Absolutely.
Speaking of evolution, let's talk about a bug that feels like a blast from the past. The dynamic SQL error next to 303.
Ah, yes. Error next 303. This is basically a collision between 1990s database design and 2025 reporting standards.
Walk us through this. What was breaking?
It was happening in the bat types table, which, ironically, stores the batch types, or journal types we were just talking about. The field for the description was set to a length of 16 characters.
16 characters. That's incredibly short. You can barely write accounts receivable in 16 characters.
You can't. In the old days, disk space was expensive, so you kept fields short. But today, under standards like IFRS or the French PCG, you are required to have very descriptive, specific names for your account groups.
So a user would type in compliant description, hit save, and boom.
The database would just reject it. String truncation error. The data is literally too big for the bucket.
So what was the fix?
The fix was technically simple. They updated the template databases, the customized empty books, to expand that field from 16 to 128 characters.
Okay, so they made the bucket bigger. Problem solved.
For the database, yes. But for the user interface, it created a disaster. This is what people often forget about software. Everything is connected. When you change the length of a field in the database, you break all the reports.
You mean the actual printed PDF documents? The invoices?
Yes. The reporting engine, Reportman, places text in specific boxes on the page. If a box is designed for 16 characters and suddenly you pour 128 characters into it, the text doesn't just magically fit, it spills over.
It overwrites the column next to it.
It overwrites the column next to it. It pushes the totals off the bottom of the page. The whole invoice looks like garbage. It looks broken.
So fixing that one SQL error required a full realignment of every single report template in the system.
Every single one. They had to go into every invoice, ledger, and balance sheet layout and adjust the text wrapping and column widths just to accommodate the potential for longer words.
That is a staggering amount of work for what sounds like a minor tweak. It's the butterfly effect of coding.
That's the nature of legacy software development. You aren't building from scratch. You're renovating a house while people are still living in it.
Now, speaking of renovating, there's another technical update here that I think tells a great story about efficiency. The saga of the Logo can at APP and AME at placeholder.
This is one of my favorite details in the whole document because it solves a problem that shouldn't exist, but it absolutely does.
The issue is that the source code was hard-coded with the name TurboCASH, right?
Right. So imagine you have a language file for French. Inside that file, there are 45 different messages that say things like, welcome to TurboCASH, or register your TurboCASH.
Okay, but the developers also sell a version of the software called osFinancials.
Exactly. And they share the same code base. So every time they wanted to release an update for osFinancials, someone had to manually go into every language file, French, Spanish, Indonesian, German, find those 45 spots, and type in osFinancials.
It sounds incredibly tedious. And knowing humans, someone is going to miss one.
Inevitably. You'd end up opening osFinancials and seeing a message that says, error in TurboCASH. It confuses the user, it degrades the brand.
So they brought back this placeholder at APP and AME at X at I. How does that work?
It's a variable. So now the language file just says, welcome to at APPANEME. When the program launches, it checks a tiny configuration file, -and.ini file, to see who it is today.
It's like the software looks in the mirror in the morning. Am I TurboCASH or am I osFinancials?
And boom, it populates the text everywhere. It means one set of language files can serve multiple products perfectly. It future-proofs the system. If they launch a third brand next year, they don't have to touch a single translation. They just change one line in a config file.
It's such a simple, elegant fix, but it must save hundreds of hours of manual labor.
And errors.
And errors, right. I want to touch on one last thing from the guide. The modernization of the user interface, specifically for the translator's benefit.
This is all about visual syntax. It's about how you communicate instructions to a translator without them, translating the instructions themselves.
The guide mentions using square brackets for buttons. So instead of just writing click next, they now write click next.
This is crucial. If I just send you the text click next, and you're translating into Indonesian, you might translate next as selanjutnya, which means afterwards or the following.
But the button on the screen is hard-coded to say lanjut.
Exactly. So the user is told to click selanjutnya, but they only see a button that says Lanjut. They get confused.
Mm-hmm.
By putting next in brackets, next, it signals to the translator. This is a proper noun. This is a UI element. Make sure the word you put here matches the button label exactly.
They did a similar thing with navigation paths, right? Using the little arrow symbol.
Yes, and enclosing the path in single quotes. So set up company info. It tells the translator, this is a breadcrumb trail. Do not change the order and don't try to make this a grammatically correct sentence. It protects the integrity of the navigation instructions.
It seems like so much of this update is just about preventing humans from making human errors.
That's right.
Whether it's the SQL character limit, the batch journal swap, or these brackets, it's all about putting guardrails on the process.
That is the essence of mature software development. You aren't just writing code for the computer. You're designing a system that can survive contact with translators, tax laws, and users who might be in a completely different hemisphere.
So when we step back and look at this Indonesian development localization document, it's clearly not just an update. It's a restructuring.
It is. It's an acknowledgement that localization is actually jurisdictional adaptation. You're molding the tool to fit the legal and cultural shape of the market.
Right.
If you don't add the NIB field, you aren't compliant.
Right.
If you don't include the Sharia logic, you aren't relevant. If you don't fix the SQL limit, you aren't functional.
It really makes you wonder about the other software we use every day. We trust these systems to handle our money, our taxes, our legal identities. But underneath it all, it's just text files and database tables that someone had to manually configure.
And usually it's all held together by a team of people arguing over whether batch means a stack of paper or a jug of milk.
That is a terrifying and wonderful thought.
It is.
I want to leave everyone with a final thought on that note. We talked about that placeholder at ABP NAME, WAY or EA, the code that lets the software know its own name.
Yeah.
It's a tiny string of characters. But if that file is missing or corrupt, the software doesn't know what it is.
An identity crisis in the code.
Exactly. Now think about the global financial infrastructure. It's all just layers of these placeholders. Codes for currencies, codes for tax rates, translations for legal terms. We assume the system is solid rock, but it's actually a web of millions of tiny, invisible decisions made by developers and translators.
Right.
If a decimal point moves in a config file or a word is mistranslated in a legal agreement, the whole thing can buckle. How much of our stability is resting on these invisible threads?
That is a question that might keep a few auditors up at night.
Well, we'll let them worry about that. That's all for this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of accounting software.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.